Okay. And well, we are all looking forward to your talk and to listening to your speech. And I have to introduce you perhaps with a couple of sentences. Marco Armiero is the director of the Environmental Humanities Laboratory at the KTH Royal Institute of Stockholm, Sweden. And he's based there right now, where he's an associate professor of environmental history. And he's also the elected president of the European Society for Environmental History since 2019, right? And well, he's the author of A Rugged Nation, Mountains and the Making of Modern Italy, and co-editor of several volumes, actually, such as A History of Environmentalism, Local Struggles, Global Histories, published in 2014, and an environmental history of mass migration, published in 2017, I guess, right? So today he's going to talk about an environmental history of modern migrations and present his idea of what an environmental history of migrations may look like, focusing on case studies from his research on Italians in the US, right? And well, by looking at work, nature, and bodies all together, as he was saying. So Marco, thanks a lot, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I would like to thank you, Irmak, for inviting me today, and of course, to the Ataturk Institute for having me. It's really a pleasure and an honor. And I need also to thank all of you for being with me today. I am very grateful for this opportunity. I will go and share my screen now. So I have prepared a presentation for us today. I think that you can see it right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
very
perfect.
good. So we can start if it would work. But it's not. Sometimes it can happen. Why? So I am here sharing the. Sorry for this. Okay. Yes. Okay.
Now it works.
Yes, it's working. Thank you. So today I am going to talk precisely about migration and environment in an historical perspective. Starting from this book that Irmak has just mentioned, a volume that I co-edited with Richard Tucker. The book was published at the end of 2017 by Routledge. And I am very proud of this volume because this volume is probably the first one. I would say it's the first one completely dedicated to the environmental history of migration. It's a book which contains 11 chapters engaging on very diverse themes connecting migration and the environment. So we have a chapter on Chinese in the Australian gold rush, Italians and Germans in Brazil, Japanese in Hawaii, and Italian miners in Belgium, just to give you some examples. But the volume also engages with more theoretical, if you wish, themes, such as the genealogies of the discourse on environmental induced migration and the racist taste of some kind of environmentalist movements and discourses. For my research, I have worked on several different kind of, I forgot to start my, yes, on several different kind of sources and materials. Mostly, I started my research on the environmental history of migration in the US, working on several kind of archives, mainly the Institute for the History of Migration in St. Paul, Minnesota, the Bancroft Library in California, the Sonoma Wine Library. Unfortunately, it's just a library. And yes, and several, and of course, the Stanford Library, which has a section dedicated to migration history. Those are some, and the San Francisco Public Library. San Francisco Public Library has a special section on Italians in California. So just to give you a few ideas on the kind of materials I have been working on. Let me start very briefly telling you something about why environmental historians and of course political ecologists should research right connections linking migration, I say, a fake picture. I don't know if you can recognize the place. Is actually Buckingham Palace, and there was an exhibition in London called London Futures, which was an exhibition at Museum of London, and the idea was to imagine the future of the city. And one is this image, very dystopic, isn't it, with this enormous, with gigantic shantytown, slum, completely surrounding Buckingham Palace. And the idea was that all the people living there would be eventually some kind of climate change refugees. So according to the United Nations Refugee Agency, since 2009, and I'm quoting here, an estimate of 1 person every second has been displaced by a disaster, with an average of 22 million people displaced by climate or weather-related events since 2008, end quote. A recently published report from the World Bank calculates that by 2050, more or less, I mean, actually more than 140 million people will be moving from sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America because of climate change related issues. And climate change also became some kind of, security problem. For instance, the UN Security Council in 2007 pointed out to the problem of migration and climate change as a security issue. So I would say that if it is true that a good historian should buy a newspaper in her way on the archive, meaning with this that basically a historian should interrogate the past, having in mind the question, the issues of the present, I think that no discussion, as environmental historians, we should engage with the issue of environment and migration. This is not completely new in a sense, because as you know from the seminal work of Alfred Crosby, environmental historians have worked on the ecological effects of colonization. I don't know, I think that you are all familiar with Alfred Crosby's thesis on ecological imperialism, or the so-called Colombian exchange. Actually, I am always a little bit laughing when I think of the Colombian exchange, because it seems very, how can I say, peaceful, right? Let's exchange something. And it doesn't look so peaceful to me, the conquest and the mass murder of millions of natives. But anyway, let's call it the Colombian exchange. So with Alfred Crosby, we have been already, and by we I mean the environmental history community, have already engaged with the connection linking colonization and the environment, right? The thesis for, maybe if there are students in the audience, I'm not sure, the thesis was pretty simple. The colonization, conquest of the Americas happened not only for the military power of Portuguese and then the English, basically, and a bit of French, but it was also connected with some kind of ecological, Crosby speaks of ecological portamento, a complex ecological baggage that the Europeans were bringing with them in the New World. So germs, guns, and steel, as Jared Diamond would say, basically popularizing what Alfred Crosby wrote actually much earlier than him. However, that said, if we know a lot about colonization and the environment, what do we know about actually millions of migrants which moved around the world without having the colonial cargo of either the conquistadores or Her Majesty subjects? Because of course it's different if you go in Central America or South America, having with you, the cargo, the luggage, the power of the empire. But what is instead if we think about millions of migrants traveling around the world without that imperial and colonial cargo? In the introduction of the book that I just show you, the Routledge book, in the introduction, Richard Tucker and myself, we came up with these three styles, three ways of doing the environmental history of migration, of modern migration. We call the assertive style, the constructivist style, and the embodied style. And today, what I'm going to do is to present to you these three styles, with then giving you some examples from my own research on Italian immigrants in the US. So let's start with the assertive style. The key word for the assertive style is, at least I believe, is making. Conceptualizing the assertive style, I was very influenced by the new Western history. Now, I don't know how much you are familiar with Western history and New Western history. Just as a piece of information, maybe of odd information, I was also trained as a Western historian because I was a postdoc at the Bill Land Center for the American West in Stanford, working with Richard White, for those who are familiar a little bit with the environmental history community. So what was the new Western history? Very briefly, there is a classic, I would say, Western history, which is embodied by Frederick Jackson Turner, the frontier thesis. The idea was that America was born in the frontier, in the West, because before moving to the West, actually there was no America and no Americans. It was just a colony of the old world, of Europe. It was in the meeting with the wild nature of the frontier that America and Americans were born. Now, I don't need to tell you, right, that Frederick Jackson Turner was, reproducing the typical stereotype about the West, what was wild about the West and why the West was not, was basically even not the existence of the Native Americans. No, they were not there. They were just nature. The New Western history was a reaction to this, and it was basically the New Western historians. They were complicating the landscape of the West, introducing a lot of different, odd, not so mainstream actors. So immigrants, Native Americans, women, prostitutes, Chinese, and so on and so forth. So not the usual male Anglo-Saxon pioneer. The new Western history was doing that. And I was influenced by this kind of historiography in my thinking about the assertive style. I think that what is the key aim of the assertive style is discovering the traces of immigrants' work and culture in the environment. As I said, this is the main aim of the assertive style. Now, what is the problem with the assertive style? The problem with the assertive style is that sometimes it can become rather celebratory. So the idea is, okay, now we do not, we are free of the Turnerian, Frederick Jackson Turner style. So we are not celebrating the Anglo-white pioneer, but finally we can celebrate also the Mexican pioneer, also the Italian pioneer, right? And it's actually, this was done. An historian in the 70s or 80s, I'm not sure. I am very bad with dates, actually. Probably I'm the worst historian ever. But I think it was in the 80s. Andrew Roll published a book on Italian immigrants in the American West, and especially in California. The book was very important for me, it was very useful for me. However, the book is very celebratory. So it seems like that the main aim of the author was to say, you know what? Also also the Italians were actually pioneers. We were precisely as the good cowboys in the American West. I think that this is not the aim of the assertive style, to uncover, discover the traces of the work and culture of immigrants, which the second style is what we have called the constructivist style. And for the constructive style, let me see the timing here. For the constructive style, we think that the keyword is naming. I said that for the assertive style, the keyword is making. Here, the keyword is naming. And the constructive style places at the center the perceptions, or we can say the migrants' cultures. However, this should not be interpreted as the immaterial part of the environmental history of migration. So you have the material, sorry, you have the material part with the assertive style, the making, and then you have the immaterial part with the constructive style about perception and culture, the naming. Well, I think that this is actually wrong. We should not think of this style in this way. Why? Because I think that reading, understanding the environment around us always has strong material effects. So it's not material, it's not immaterial at all. It's very material. So as I said, in which way, the question is in which ways did immigrants understand the environment where they moved? And it's actually rejecting the dichotomy opposing material and cultural. This is not the point. Finally, we move to the third style, the style that we call the embodied style. Here, the keyword can be feeling. So we have making, naming, and feeling. The environment is not only around us or in front of the migrants. It is also, the environment is also in a dialectic relationship with migrants and with their bodies. For Marx, for instance, humans are in a metabolic relationship with nature, and this relationship is mediated through work. No, there is a very famous quote. Marx was saying men, of course he was using men and not humans, but anyway, let's say humans are changing nature through their work, and in doing that they change themselves. No, so humans change nature through work, and in the process they also change themselves. However, what is relevant here for me is that the environment is not just natural. It's not just something where humans happen to be, but that environment is also a political fact where power relations and inequalities matter. So this is crucial because I would say that migrants, they were traversing this political space, this political environment, and this political environment was affecting migrants' bodies, not just because you live in an environment and you are affected by the environment, but actually because the whole social environmental structure, or we can call it formations, following Eric Swingedon, for instance. So these social environmental formations were social and environmental at the same time. So migrants were affected not by an environment, using quotation marks, by a rather they were affected by a specific social environmental formation, which was actually placing them on in a very specific hierarchical connection to other humans and the environment. But when I am now going to present you a few examples, I hope that this will become clearer than now in theory. So, as I said, I will now go through these three styles: the assertive, the constructivist, and the embodied. And I will try to show you how an environmental history of migration can be done, crossing these three styles, and I will using then, as I said, my own research on Italian immigrants in the US. This slide is presenting a quote from a book published in 1913 by the Italian journalist and writer Amy Bernardi. I don't need to read, I think, the quote, because you can read it by yourself, right? But you really see here the assertive style. Basically, Italians are contributing to the making of America. No? They are assembling wood, opening channels, they are putting railroads, they are building telegraph and telephone, they are basically constructing America. So they are part of this making of the America, the assertive style, looking for the traces of the work and cultures of immigrants in the environment where they moved. And now let's look inside. Let's open the box of the assertive style. Between the 1890s and the 1900s, more or less 1,500 Italians arrived in New Orleans. They settled in Arkansas, where they cleared the land and drained the marshes. So it's a very pioneer story. Brave pioneers clearing the land, draining the marshes, settled down in the American South. However, they failed. It's not the proper pioneer story, it's because they failed. And they failed not because they were not pioneer enough, too Catholic, too Mediterranean, too little Anglo-Saxon to succeed. And maybe you need here a piece of information. According to the American rules and regulation, Italians were not white at the arrival in Ellis Island in New York. Ellis Island was the place where the ships will be, the migrants will be examined and then, eventually also sent back to their countries if they were sick or anything else. So Italians were white from Rome up to the north, but somebody from Naples, from Sicily, and so on and so forth, they were not actually white, but they were from Mediterranean races. Not clear what does it mean, right? When you speak about race, it's always pretty confusing. Whatever it is, they were not white. So as I said, they failed in New Orleans, in Arkansas. They failed not because they were not pioneers enough, not because they were not white enough. They failed because of the socio-ecologies of the places in combination with their bodies and cultures. We could say that Mississippi mosquitoes plus peonage equal failure. The idea that Italian migrants were able to resist malaria because, Italy was a country with a very deep malaric epidemic was wrong, because the Mississippi mosquitoes, so the malaria there was different from the Italian malaria. And then the fact that those people were more or less slave, they were in a condition of peonage, which means that they were basically stuck working in the plantations because they couldn't escape. They had such a huge debt already on the arrival that they couldn't either go away nor basically gain enough to improve their condition. So this socio-ecological situation made them failing. So again, those people moved to a place in which they did affect the environments that where they moved. I said these 1,500 Italians, they cleared the land, they drained the marshes. So you can see the traces of their presence in the landscape. Actually, you can see the traces of their presence also in the cemetery in the region with all these Italian names in the area. But it's not a success story. It's not the typical pioneer story. So you see that you don't need to be celebratory in order to apply a assertive style. And I want to give you another example, and then we move to the next slide. to the other style. The other example I want to give you, 1909, at the beginning of the 20th century, 1909, in California. In that book define Secondo Guasti, an Italian migrant, as, and I am quoting from the book, a man who had faith in the desert, end quote. This was the definition. Secondo Guasti was a man who had faith in the desert. Why? Guasti was an Italian migrant who moved to California in 1883, and later he became one of the wealthiest producer of wine in the state of California. So why this man had faith in the desert? Because his Italian vineyards and co. transformed, and again I am quoting from the, okay, and vineyards and co. transformed a sandy place in a garden. And actually, sandy place was precisely the name that the Native Americans from the region gave to the area where the vineyard was placed. However, just to avoid the pioneer trap, this fantastic story of this Italian who became the wealthiest guy in California and transformed the desert in a garden, let's try to make something clear. So for instance, the sandy place that we are talking about was not transformed by Italians, but actually it was transformed by Mexican and Chinese workers, because Secondo Guasti was actually hiring Chinese and Mexican workers to do the work. And even the way in which the settlement was built, was designed, followed the faulty lines of race and ethnicity. So you have, the houses for the Italians, those for Mexicans, and those for Chinese workers. So basically here, what I'm trying to give you is an idea about the fact that the landscape, the environment is not natural. It's not just natural, but it's actually continuously redesigned and rearranged by what we have called socio-ecological relationships. The relationship between Italian capitalists like Secondo Guasti and Mexican and Chinese workers, between European migrants and Native Americans living there. Okay, so I hope that this can give you a little bit of flesh and bones, as we say, on this assertive style and how we can make the assertive style. I would skip this one because I'm not sure if I will be able then to go through the entire presentation. Now, let's move to the constructivist style. Again, we have a quote here. This quote introduces well what I have called the constructivist approach. Here is an officer from the Italian army speaking, actually writing. This officer, Siciliani, he was traveling around Italian communities in the US, trying to convince the Italians abroad that Italy did win the war. We are talking about the Great War, so World War I. Apparently, nobody believed so. So the Italian government needed to send this official, this officer from the Italian army to go around and convince people that actually Italy did win the war. And in this quote that you can see from the slide, this guy was quite disappointed to see that Italians in America were cultivating their backyards instead of having the green lawn of the proper Americans. No, it, as you can see from the slide, this is also this ruins the posh and clean aspect that is typical of the American neighborhoods, right? So there is actually, this is something negative that Italian migrants are doing. This idea of cultivating, of gardening, every small plot of land. Italians indeed, they did not seem to be very interested in wilderness, in wild nature, at least not in a contemplative way. An Italian migrant who arrived in California in 1902 said, and I am quoting here from a very peculiar, very particular source that I've been using a lot, which are the transcripts of oral history projects. This is very common, at least in the American libraries and archives. They have done a lot of very huge, very wide oral history projects, and everything has been transcribed. So I am using oral history, but second-hand oral history here, okay? So this guy, he said in this oral history interview that when he arrived in California in 1902, and I am now quoting from his interview, California, there is no question about it, was a paradise then. Sonoma County was pretty because of agriculture. Vineyards were all over. There was nothing but vineyards and plums. End quote. Hence, we can say that for this guy, but more in general for Italian migrants, California was an Eden, was a paradise, but that paradise was created by the work of humans. This is very important, I think, from almost a theoretical point of view, because more or less in the same years, John Muir, one of the fathers of environmentalism, no? One of the most important, one of the key figures in the creation of the American national parks, for instance, John Muir, he was saying precisely the opposite. He was saying that nature is a paradise when it is left alone, when there is no vineyards, no plums, when actually nature is not affected, changed by humans. And you see here really a big divergence in the perception of nature and what is actually appreciated as nature and what is not. Maybe we can skip this, and I would like instead to talk about another example of this constructivist style. Migrants were able to see things that were invisible to the WASP, white Anglo-Saxon and Protestant Americans. We know that Italians, for instance, were collecting foliage in the streets of New Jersey cities for their animals, the animals that they kept in their homes. We know also that they saw the city as an open mine from where everything could be rescued, could be used, reused, recycled. It's not by chance that, for instance, Italian migrants were deeply involved in the waste business in the US. There is this connection with garbage, with waste, with this idea of recycling, reusing, reselling everything you can find in the open veins of the city. Today, I wish, and I am now ending, today I wish to use a different kind of source, which is a novel written by an Italian-American writer, Tony Ardizzone. In the novel, Ardizzone tells the story of a Sicilian migrant who was surviving at the beginning of the 20th century in Chicago, collecting things from the streets. At a certain point in the story, in the novel, this migrant was able to reach the rich part, the rich neighborhood of the city, to find there a field of wild artichokes. While he was collecting these wild artichokes, a lady, the owner of the land, approached him, and he was very scared. He was sure that he would be put in jail or something because he was stealing from that woman. And instead, the lady asked him how much he wanted to be paid to clean the field from, weed. And here you can see really a different way of seeing the nature. For the white lady, the owner of the plot, those were just weed. For Zio Griddu, this was the name of this Sicilian migrant, those were that was actually a field rich with a lot of things that he could collect. So precisely seeing stuff which was invisible to others. And I don't have a lot of time here because I promised to be in 30 minutes. The embodied style, this is a quote from Alice Hamilton. Alice Hamilton was the founder of public health medicine and especially of industrial hygiene. And here you see what we are talking about. No, basically the fact that migrants were affected by pollution, contamination, and by the hazards of work much more than Anglo-Saxon white and other kind of workers. Let's go directly to the, well, maybe let's do in this way. If you are curious about to know more about the embodied style, maybe I can go back to this during the Q&A question. Why I am now moving to the conclusion. So what should an environmental history of migration look like? Let me be a bit provocative here and say that perhaps it should not look like an environmental history of migrations. What I mean with this is that perhaps we should not be obsessed with the environmental, in quotation mark, right? With the environmental part, trying to isolate it from the rest. A good example of what I'm trying to say is in Donald Worster's Dust Bowl, published in 1979. The Dust Bowl could be defined as a clear case of environmental induced migration. You know the story, big storms in the 1930s in the Great Plains of the US, right? A lot of people leaving those plains and moving to either California or the East Coast. But Worster refused to separate the environmental, the economic, the social, and the cultural in his account of the Dust Bowl. So the ecology of the capitalistic agriculture produced not only the Dust Bowl, because actually the Dust Bowl was produced by the introduction of industrial capitalistic agriculture in the Great Plains, but this capitalistic agriculture produced both the Dust Bowl, so a blend of climate, economy, and society, but also the Oquis. The Oquis was the name of the migrants leaving the Dust Bowl areas. So the capitalistic agriculture produced also the Oquis. That is an ecology of migrations and dispossession, where the Oquis were those migrants, capitalists or climate refugees? Were they running away from the banks, from the debts they had in the Great Plains, or they were running from the dust storms in the Great Plains? Well, if we agree with David Harvey, with the geographer David Harvey, that capitalism is an ecology, then the answer can be easy, and we can assume that actually it was both. They were, you know, capitalists and climate refugees, because capitalism is an ecology in that case. And I will stop here more or less on time, maybe 5 minutes more than I was supposed to. Thank you very much for your attention, and I am looking forward to your questions, comments.
It was perfect, Marco. Thanks a lot, and thanks a lot for this very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. Maybe we can give kind of 5 minutes of break so that everyone can grab tea or coffee or water, something, and then we continue with more energies with the Q&A session.